The following podcast reflects our personal opinions and interpretations of publicly available information and should not be construed as factual assertions or legal advice. While we aim to provide accurate commentary, this discussion is speculative in nature and intended for entertainment and informational purposes only. We have taken care to conduct thorough research and carefully investigate the information discussed to ensure accuracy where possible, but we acknowledge that we may not have access to all the facts. As freelance producers, our views are entirely our own and do not represent or reflect the positions of any individuals or entities mentioned in this discussion. Any references to individuals, organizations, or events are made in good faith based on publicly available sources. We expressly disclaim any intent to harm reputations or imply unlawful conduct by any party. And with that said, let's get into it.
Hey y'all, Lauren here, TV producer by day, reality junkie by night, and your guide to the galaxy of shows you love to hate, hate to love, and live to bitch about. This is Reality Bites, the podcast where we deep dive into the week's buzziest reality TV and pop culture happenings.
I'm Morgan. By night, I'm Lauren's co-host and other better half. And by day, I moonlight as an executive producer. I've been around the Bravo block enough to know, let's just say, where the bodies are buried.
We'll take you through the biggest and best water cooler moments of the week through a producer's lens you won't find anywhere else.
Buckle up, buttercups.
I've had enough of you, you beast.
Beast? How dare you?
This is Reality Bites.
Guys, we are dropping this episode before Justin Baldoni's countersuit hits because we fully believe and expect it's going to land tomorrow or today if you're listening to this on Monday. And why do we think that? Well, for one, Scooter Braun just deleted all of his social media this weekend. And while we don't know his exact reasoning, I do think it's worth noting that he owns 51% of Melissa Nathan's PR firm, the Agency Group, which we know has been directly tied to this case. And if Baldoni's countersuit is about to drop, it wouldn't be surprising if, well, Scooter's name comes up. And given how we know the Swifties have been waiting for, and do always wait for, any excuse to come for good old Scooter, it makes sense that he'd want to get out of Dodge before the storm hits. So before that happens, we're breaking down where everything stands, what's already been filed, what's being left out of the coverage, and, well, what we're expecting next. When we first covered Megan Twohey's New York Times piece in episode 3, we broke down the timing of its release, how it dropped just hours after Blake Lively's complaint went public, raising serious questions about whether the paper had time to properly investigate the claims before running a 4,000-word expose. We noted that for a journalist of Twohey's caliber, known for her work exposing Harvey Weinstein, the expectation is thorough, airtight reporting. But given how fast the article hit the press, we asked, was this a case of rigorous journalism, or was the Times operating off a preset narrative? Well, now as we know, Baldoni and his co-plaintiffs filed a $250 million lawsuit against the New York Times, and their legal complaint takes those same questions we raised and goes even further. According to the lawsuit, at 9:46 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on December 20th, 2024, Megan Twohey sent a request for comment to Baldoni's team, giving them until noon the next day, a mere 14 hours overnight to respond. And at 2:16 a.m., Baldoni's lawyers fired back, calling Lively's accusations, quote, categorically false, and alleging that she was attempting to, quote, fix her own public image by weaponizing a legal complaint. They also claim that long before any official filings, Lively's PR rep, Leslie Sloan, we all know that name, was planting negative stories about Justin Baldoni and Wayfarer Studios in the press. Now, here's where things get perhaps a little more damning. The lawsuit claims that rather than waiting for Baldoni's response deadline, the New York Times published the article nearly 2 hours early at 10:11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time on December 21st. That detail alone cuts right to the heart of Baldoni's case. Was this ever a fair, objective piece, or was it always going to paint him as the villain no matter what evidence he presented? Baldoni's legal team isn't just alleging bias. They're calling out the New York Times for intentionally omitting key context from text messages used in the article as well. To support their claim, they point to exchanges between Baldoni's PR reps, Melissa Nathan and Jennifer Abel. The New York Times article cited a conversation where Nathan allegedly celebrated a negative headline about Lively, texting Abel, quote, "That's why you hired me, right? I'm the best," end quote. On its own, that reads like an admission of guilt. But according to Baldoni's lawsuit, the New York Times deliberately excluded the previous texts where Nathan had actually expressed concern that the story was being falsely attributed to her. It said, quote, "Damn, this is not fair because it's also not me. Everything now looks like it's me," end quote. The lawsuit argues that by removing this key part of the conversation, the Times article intentionally misrepresented the PR team's role, making it seem like Baldoni's camp was actively coordinating the negative press, when in reality, they were reacting to stories they had no control over. This raises a major ethical question. If the New York Times really had access to, quote, thousands of text messages and emails, as the article claimed, why didn't they include messages that exonerated Baldoni's team? The lawsuit argues that this wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate cherry-picking of evidence to fit a predetermined narrative. Now, beyond the text message controversy, the lawsuit calls out the New York Times for completely ignoring the role of Stephanie Jones, Baldoni's former PR rep who, according to the filing, played a pivotal role in leaking private communications to the press. And here's where this gets even more interesting, because we already flagged this in episode 4 when we covered Lively's CRD complaint. One of the biggest questions we raised back then was, why wasn't Stephanie Jones mentioned at all in Lively's filing, nor was her publicity firm JonesWorks PR? At the time of filming and promoting It Ends With Us, JonesWorks PR under Stephanie Jones was handling PR for Baldoni and Wayfarer Studios, right up until August 2023, when Jennifer Abel was fired and left to start her own firm. Yet, despite being at the center of the film's press strategy, Jones' name was nowhere in Lively's complaint, which instead focused on Jennifer Abel, her employee at the time, and Melissa Nathan of the agency group. That omission seemed odd, especially given that the same text messages at the heart of Lively's case were also being used in Stephanie Jones's separate defamation lawsuit against Baldoni, Abel, Nathan, etc. Now, Baldoni's lawsuit suggests a reason for this gap. Jones wasn't left out by accident. She was actively working with Lively. According to the filing, Jones betrayed her former clients by leaking internal communications to the press in what the lawsuit describes as a quid pro quo arrangement. This aligns with Lively's team to protect her own reputation and secure future opportunities, or at least that's what it claims. If true, this completely shifts the dynamic of the media narrative. It means that the New York Times article didn't just leave out inconvenient facts. It potentially omitted a key player who had insider access to both sides. At the end of the day, defamation lawsuits aren't just about proving a story was misleading. Baldoni's team will need to prove not just that the article was misleading, but that it was published with actual malice, meaning that the New York Times knew the information was false or had reckless disregard for the truth. That's a high bar to clear. And while we wait for Baldoni's countersuit to drop, likely tomorrow, let's take a look at Lively's actual suit filed in New York and something that's been overlooked in mainstream coverage of this case: the legal strategy behind where and when Lively filed her complaints. Because if you look at the timeline, there's a pattern that suggests this wasn't just about filing a lawsuit. It was potentially about controlling the rollout of the story. Now, on December 21st, 2024, Lively didn't file a lawsuit, which we've previously discussed. Instead, she filed a complaint with the California Civil Rights Department, or the CRD. Now, in California, before you can file a workplace harassment suit, you have to go through the CRD first. That's just how the law works there. But here's where things start to look strategic. Because when Lively finally did decide to sue, she didn't file in California. Instead, she waited 10 days and took the case to federal court in New York. Now, legally speaking, the CRD process wasn't necessary if she planned to sue in New York all along. So why go through it? Well, one possible explanation is jurisdiction. Wayfarer Studios and some of the production companies involved are based in California, so that may have given her grounds to file there. But there is another angle here: public relations. Filing with the CRD allows the case to become public immediately if elected by the filing party. And unlike federal lawsuits, which don't get instant media attention. And if made public, journalists can gain access to the document and report on it right away. So was this about making sure her accusations were in the press before Baldoni had the chance to respond? Because by the time she actually files suit in New York, the media narrative had already been firmly established in the court of public opinion. And if you look at the timing, it does raise a few questions. Now, her CRD complaint went public on December 21st. The New York Times article dropped just hours later. Then, 10 days later, she files the actual lawsuit in federal court. So the question is, was the California filing a legal requirement or a PR move? And here's another issue with jurisdiction. If the majority of the alleged harassment happened on set in New Jersey or New York, why not just file the lawsuit there from the beginning? Because if California was the right legal venue, why not keep the case there? And if New York was the right legal venue, why involve California at all? That's the kind of inconsistency that Baldoni's legal team could seize on, arguing that the California complaint was never about legal necessity, but about setting the stage for the media narrative before the actual lawsuit. Now, let's talk about something else that's not quite adding up: the timing of when Lively actually came forward with these allegations. Lively's lawsuit says that the alleged harassment happened between May and June of 2023, which is important because that's when the SAG-AFTRA strike shut down Hollywood in July. And here's where things don't really make sense. The SAG-AFTRA strike was actively negotiating workplace protections for actors. One of their core demands was stronger protections against harassment on set. So if Lively had just experienced workplace harassment in May and June, why not bring it to SAG-AFTRA while they were literally fighting for these exact protections? And if she had come forward during the strike, it could have been used as leverage in those negotiations, a real-time example of why the protections were needed. But instead, she stayed silent throughout the entire strike, and she waited over a year to file a complaint. And look, we're not saying that there is a right or a wrong timeline for someone to come forward. People process these experiences in different ways and in different timelines. But it's also true that Lively has been through this before. Back in 2017, during the Me Too movement, she spoke publicly about being sexually harassed by a makeup artist on set. She knows how reporting structures in Hollywood work, and she knows what SAG-AFTRA does for actors. So why not go through her union, an organization designed to protect actors in these exact situations? And that's where the timing issue becomes a potential legal weakness in her case. Because if Baldoni's legal team argues that this wasn't an urgent workplace issue, but rather a carefully timed legal strategy, it could undermine her claims in court. So here's where things take an interesting turn. Blake Lively never went to SAG-AFTRA during the 2023 strike to raise concerns about workplace harassment, right? Even though the union was actively negotiating protections for actors at that time. But you know what she did lobby for? Her Producers Guild of America, or PGA certification, a prestigious industry distinction that recognizes legitimate producer contributions to a film. And based on what's claimed in Baldoni's lawsuit, this wasn't just a request, it was a demand. According to the filing, Lively pressured Baldoni, Jamie Heath, Sony, and other producers to write letters to the PGA on her behalf, vouching for her as a producer. Now, Unlike SAG-AFTRA, where she could have reported harassment through her union, the PGA doesn't just hand out its mark to anyone with a producer credit. You actually have to prove that you did the work. Things like developing the project, or securing financing, or managing the day-to-day production. But according to the lawsuit, Lively didn't perform those duties. Sony and Wayfarer didn't believe she was qualified for the mark, and at first, they refused to misrepresent her contributions to their guild. Even though Baldoni and Heath had already conceded on nearly every other demand she made, as alleged in the lawsuit, they stood firm on this one. The lawsuit claims that Lively was not happy when Wayfarer and Baldoni wouldn't back her application. She allegedly instructed Sony to go back to Wayfarer and Baldoni with a clear message, with which they say is, quote, "Any goodwill left between us is done." In other words, back me on this or we're finished. And eventually, in the face of what the lawsuit describes as, quote, persistent threats, Baldoni and Heath gave in. Now, this brings us to the Jamie Heath email, which was sent internally at Wayfarer Studios after they wrote the letter for Lively. Heath explicitly says that they only agreed to endorse her PGA mark because they felt trapped. In an internal email, Heath described the situation as feeling like, quote, extortion by Lively. And he makes it clear that they left out the truth of how and why she was able to contribute. In other words, they weren't backing her because she earned it. They backed her because they felt that they had no choice. Now let's take a step back. Lively was willing to push for industry recognition as a producer, even though the people she worked with didn't necessarily think that she deserved it per their claims. Yet, when it came to reporting workplace harassment, which could have led to real industry-wide protections for all actors during the strike, she doesn't seem to have done anything. And that raises the obvious question. Was this about workplace rights, or was this about power and positioning? Because if she had spoken up during the SAG-AFTRA strike, her claim could have helped shape real policy. But instead, she waits over a year to file her complaint. Yet when it came time to lobbying for a title that would benefit her career, she was relentless. It's a stark contrast, and one that, if this case goes to trial, Baldoni's legal team could use to challenge the credibility of her claims. Because at the end of the day, the PGA mark is an exclusive club, and it is a status symbol in Hollywood. And it seems like Lively was more concerned about securing that title than using the power she already had to fight for better protections for all actors. Just food for thought. Now, while we're on the subject of guilds, let's talk about the Directors Guild of America, or the DGA. In Hollywood, the editing process is one of the most protected phases of filmmaking, especially under DGA rules. For directors, the first 10 weeks of post-production are sacred. It's a, quote, protected period where they are allowed to privately assemble their cut of the film without outside interference. Now, this is standard practice across the industry. It allows directors the space to experiment, refine, and creatively shape the final product before producers, studios, or actors weigh in. But according to Baldoni's lawsuit, he never got that full protected period. Instead, Lively allegedly requested access to the editing bay, and things escalated from there. Now, it's not unusual for a producer, especially one who's also the film's lead actor, to want to give input during the editing process. Actors with producer credits often have a vested interest in how their performance is presented, and many will provide feedback or request small changes. But what Baldoni's lawsuit describes goes beyond standard input. It claims that Lively initially requested to sit in on editing sessions from the get-go, that the original agreement was for 2 days of collaboration, but that it expanded into 10 days, during which she worked alone in the editing bay several times. And eventually, she replaced Baldoni's editors with one she frequently used by Ryan Reynolds, who we spoke about in our previous episode. She also brought in new composers from a Reynolds project, replacing the film's award-winning composer. At this point, the situation wasn't just about creative input. It had turned into, well, 2 competing versions of the film. Now, this is where things get complicated from an industry standpoint, because DGA rules exist for a reason. They protect directors from losing control of their own projects. In most cases, unless a director is fired or a film is taken over by a studio due to serious creative disputes, There shouldn't be two competing versions of a movie. Yet, according to the lawsuit, that's exactly what happened. Lively allegedly pushed for her own cut of the film to be completed, even though she had no contractual right to edit the movie. And when it became clear that both versions couldn't exist, the studio came up with a compromise. Now, we spoke about this in a previous episode, but it's confirmed here in Baldoni's suit. Sony and Wayfarer audience tested both Blake and Justin's edits. Ultimately, Baldoni's director's cut scored higher. And while Lively allegedly agreed to step back if his cut won, that didn't ultimately happen according to the lawsuit. Instead, Lively continued to push for her version to be the one released. And here's where the power dynamics come into play. The lawsuit claims that Lively made it clear she wouldn't promote the film unless her cut was used. This puts the studio in a very difficult position. Marketing a film heavily depends on its lead star. If your biggest name refuses to promote the project, that can, well, obviously directly impact box office performance, which we know is a huge staple of what Sony needs to financially survive, as we spoke about in episode 5. So the question is, was Lively's request for editing control a natural extension of her producer role? Or was it an overreach that challenged standard DGA protections for directors? And most importantly, what does this mean for future productions? Because this case highlights a bigger industry discussion. At what point do actors with producer credits cross into the director's territory? And if a lead actor's promotional influence can dictate final cut decisions, does that set a new precedent for creative control in Hollywood? It's a rare situation for sure. Two competing versions of a film, one from the director, one from the lead actor, producer. And regardless of where you stand, it's clear that this isn't just a typical post-production disagreement. Now, let's take a little turn. One of the more unexpected revelations from Baldoni's lawsuit is just how much control Lively allegedly exercised over the film's wardrobe department, far beyond what's typically granted to lead actors, even those with producer credits. Now, it's not unusual for an A-list star to have some level of input into their character's look. Many actors negotiate wardrobe approval in their contracts, ensuring they're comfortable with how their character is presented on screen. But those decisions are normally made collaboratively, with input from the director, producers, and the costume designer, who is in charge of all things wardrobe. According to the lawsuit, Lively went well beyond that, exercising near total control over her wardrobe in a way that, according to Baldoni's team, disrupted the production process and significantly inflated costs. Instead of working within the wardrobe department's pre-approved designs, the lawsuit alleges that Lively frequently overrode creative decisions, sending the costume team hundreds of reference images at all hours to dictate exactly how her character should dress. And the production had already spent weeks carefully selecting and purchasing her wardrobe. But in many cases, they had to reshop entire outfits, leading to significant budget overruns and wasted resources. This is a big deal, guys. Now, one example cited in the lawsuit is that Lively insisted that her character, quote, had money, and therefore should be wearing $5,000 designer shoes, a choice that allegedly led Baldoni to question aspects of the script, which had already been finalized and approved by the studios. These type of unexpected expenses can be a major problem for a film's bottom line. Productions operate on tight budgets, and wardrobe is one of many departments that has to balance creative vision with financial constraints. The lawsuit also describes another production challenge, which was Lively's refusal to attend wardrobe fittings at the production office. Instead of traveling the 15 minutes from her Tribeca residence to the production office for fittings, she allegedly required the entire wardrobe department to bring her costumes to her. Now, for context, this isn't just a minor inconvenience. Moving a film's entire wardrobe inventory multiple times requires additional labor and transportation costs, significant time lost in production scheduling, which is like razor tight, guys, and logistical headaches for the wardrobe team, who already are juggling several other cast members as well. If true, these last-minute demands would have added both time and cost to an already tight production schedule and budget, two things that studios work really hard to avoid through careful pre-production planning. The lawsuit argues that these changes were never a part of Lively's contract either, meaning that the studio had not budgeted for them in advance. Yet, because of her dual role as both lead actress and executive producer, production felt pressured to accommodate her requests rather than risk on-set tensions. Now, one of the more highly publicized allegations from Lively's complaints was an incident involving Baldoni in Lively's trailer, which she claimed led to a, quote, lengthy outburst that delayed filming for hours while Baldoni, quote, cried in her dressing room. That claim was later picked up by the New York Times article, reinforcing the perception that Baldoni became overly emotional on set. But Baldoni's lawsuit pushes back on this account, offering a very different version of events. What his lawsuit claims is that on the first day of filming, paparazzi captured photos of Lively on set wearing a costume that she had personally selected. Those photos went viral almost immediately, and not in a positive way. According to the suit, Sony executives were unhappy with how the costumes looked on camera and were concerned about the public reaction to the photos. And rather than addressing this issue directly, the studio allegedly tasked Baldoni with bringing it up to Lively himself. Now, this part is important. In Hollywood, executive producers, directors, and department heads are often forced to be the middlemen in situations like this. If a network or studio has a concern, whether it's about an actor's performance, their look on camera, or even their behavior on set, they rarely address it themselves. This goes for us in reality TV too, guys. Instead, they put the responsibility onto the on-set leadership, making them or us have the difficult conversations. And that's what Baldoni's lawsuit suggests happened here. He says that he approached Lively professionally in her trailer to discuss making some adjustments to her wardrobe because, well, Sony had directly raised concerns about it. And yes, he does admit that he teared up during that conversation, but according to Baldoni's suit, it wasn't because he was having an emotional breakdown. He said that Lively paid him a compliment during the conversation, telling him how much she admired his work as a director and actor, which at the time genuinely moved him. However, in hindsight, he claims that this moment of vulnerability may have been used against him or twisted into an exaggerated story that paints him as an overly emotional or unstable leader on set. The lawsuit firmly denies that this conversation led to any significant delays in production, calling Lively's version of events grossly misrepresented. Now, at the heart of this dispute is a fundamental power struggle between two producers. One, Baldoni, who's responsible for managing the production, and another in Lively who's exerting creative control potentially beyond her contractual role. If the lawsuit claims are accurate, it raises larger industry questions about how much influence high-profile actors should have over a film's creative and financial decisions, especially when their personal choices impact the project's budget, schedule, and overall execution. And from a business perspective, it also highlights the challenge that many directors and producers face when working with A-list talent. Like, how do you maintain creative and financial control of a project when one person, who also holds a producer credit, has the power to override key decisions? When does accommodating an actor's preferences cross the line into damaging the film itself? And when conflicts arise on set, who ultimately bears the responsibility? Actors, producers, or the studio? Now, those are larger questions that extend far beyond this case and into larger conversations about power dynamics in Hollywood. And while Baldoni's lawsuit presents a strong rebuttal to Lively's claims, there's still a long road ahead. In defamation cases like this, proving harm isn't enough. Baldoni will also have to prove that these misrepresentations were made with actual malice, and that's a very high legal bar to clear. So where does all of this leave us? Well, we've got two competing legal strategies at play. Baldoni's lawsuit against the New York Times is setting up a wider battle over media ethics and defamation. Lively's lawsuit is already raising questions about jurisdiction, timing, and industry politics. And now we're waiting for Baldoni's countersuit against Lively. Because based on everything we're seeing, we know it's coming. And frankly, guys, as I mentioned before, I'm pretty sure it's going to drop today or tomorrow. So given how this has played out so far, his legal team is likely to challenge Lively's timeline, her use of industry guilds, and whether her claims were about actual workplace issues or strategic positioning. And when that happens, expect more names to get pulled into this, including Scooter Braun. So for now, we're watching, we're waiting, and we're ready to break it all down. Because when that countersuit drops, you better believe it's going to change the conversation again. And before we wrap, guys, I just have to take a moment to give a massive shout out to my amazing partner, Lauren. This entire series has been her vision from the fucking get-go. And the research, the connections, the way she pulled everything together, she really was the backbone and driving force behind this crazy deep dive. And honestly, none of it would have happened without her. And trust me, we are just getting started, so stay tuned.